have Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International. They have their own website, creation.com, where you can go to get all sorts of questions answered on anything to do with creation, evolution, and all sorts of other things. And, of course, we love you asking Dr. John questions, and he can answer them here on air. Simply send them to our text line, 0401 949 949. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick. How are you?
Oh, fantastic. And how's your week been, Dr. John?
Oh, yeah, my week's been great. You know, lockdown as everybody else is.
Yes.
But we're all managing, and the good thing is that I've had a couple of questions to research.
Yes.
And thank you for mentioning that anybody who's got a question can text it into that text line 0401 949 949. And you'll remember we got a couple last week.
Yes, absolutely. We got one which was last Tuesday, the 14th of April. I watched David Attenborough narrated Seven Worlds, One Planet, Australia. I'd seen it before, but this time I viewed it with the biblical creation model in mind. In it, Uluru is seen from above with all these parallel ridges running in the same direction. What is the cause of that, and what do you make of the millions of years story that is put forward? I lack info to understand the biblical creation model. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And the other question was, let me see, it was, can you ask Dr. John regarding their grandson who worked at McDonald's and was inundated with orders for fish burgers on Good Friday? Where does the tradition of abstaining from eating meat on Good Friday come from? And that was from Patsy.
Yeah, well, look, that was a good one too. I'm going to address both those questions this morning, but that first one, that was a really, really tough one, not an easy one to answer. And Patsy asked, you know, the grandson was amazed at the number of fish burgers ordered from McDonald's on Good Friday. And of course, last week we were talking about Easter and the relationship with the Passover, and we talked about Good Friday. But everybody knows that traditionally in Australia anywhere, and I suppose probably throughout the Western world, Fridays have been a hugely busy day for fish and chip shops. Mm-hmm. Most of us grew up with that. And I can remember seeing the queues outside the fish and chip shop on Friday, and I'm sure it wasn't just Catholics. I mean, a lot of other denominations certainly decided that they would eat fish on some Fridays, and particularly Good Friday. But the question is, where on earth does it come from? Mm. Because as far as I'm aware, there's never been any church directive to anybody that they must eat fish. Certainly they had the prohibitions on eating meat, but never can I find that there was any directive that you must eat fish. So where did it come from? Yep. And I think this idea of abstaining from certain foods like meat, that all goes back a very, very long way in Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. And I think in the early centuries, fasting and abstinence from certain foods must have been pretty common amongst the early Christians, and probably a lot of it derived from their Jewish tradition, because fasting was a requirement for the Jews. It was only a requirement on one particular day, that was the Day of Atonement, but the Jewish tradition had added quite a lot of other days, particularly days where the Jewish people had been defeated really badly in battles, particularly the sacking of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and when they got exiled into Babylon. Mm-hmm. So they did practice fasting and abstinence quite a lot. And as we all know, the early Christians were mainly Jews. There weren't any Gentiles like us added to the number of Christians until Peter had that vision and went and spoke to the household of Cornelius the centurion. So there was probably quite a few years where all the early Christians were Jews. And old habits die pretty hard, so they probably continued the practice of fasting and abstinence. And, we all know that the Apostle Paul certainly wasn't any legalist. He knew that there was no salvation by keeping the law. But even at towards the end of the book of Acts, when he was about to embark on that trip that ended in disaster, the shipwreck and so on, they mention in Acts chapter 27 that the fast was over, and they're talking about the fast on the Day of Atonement. Well, the people on the ship, the soldiers who were looking after them, the ship's crew and so on, and most of the prisoners, they wouldn't have been Jews. But there Luke does refer to the Jewish fast. So obviously it was pretty important to all of them that, that was clearly a major event in the calendar that everybody was aware of. So I think we have to say that days of fasting and abstinence certainly go back a very, very long way in the Jewish calendar. Where the abstaining from meat came from, I think it probably was that Jesus was crucified on a Friday, so they decided to abstain from meat on that day.
Alrighty.
But I suppose you've got to then ask, where did the tradition of eating fish come from? Because, as I said before, there was no directive for that.
No, we'll talk about that just after the break. It is 15 minutes past 8. If you've got any questions for Dr. John, send them through to the text line 040. We've got Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International, and he's answering your questions. Simply text them through to our text line 0401949949. And Dr. John, you've been telling us a bit about fish, the Easter tradition of eating fish and not eating meat. Well, where did the eating fish come from?
Yes, well, it's a bit hard to find that out, but I think what we have to say is that fish must have been a very, very common type of food back in the early days, certainly in the days of Jesus, because meat was really a luxury anyway. Only the wealthy people could afford meat, but clearly fish was pretty cheap. Yep. And if you think about it, over what the Gospels say, on both occasions when Jesus multiplied and fed a whole multitude, he used fish and loaves. So fish must have been pretty common amongst ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the other things that we notice in the Gospels, in John's Gospel, is that when Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection, on one occasion he said, "Have you got anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of fish. And then there's another story where he met them on the beach at Galilee, and they'd all gone fishing, because remember that at least four of them, Peter, Andrew, John and James, had all been professional fishermen. They'd gone fishing again, and he said, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." And they had breakfast together on the beach, eating fish. And the other thing that is very, very interesting, I think, is that when the Christians devised a symbol for themselves, they used the fish symbol, and you still see that, of course, on bumper stickers and windscreen stickers in people's cars, advertising that they're Christians. And that fish symbol came from the Greek word for fish, which was ichthus. And when you look at the letters of the Greek word, they stand for, or this is why it was adapted to stand for, Jesus Christ, Son of God and Saviour. So that's the reason why I think fish became so very, very popular amongst Christians. It's quite amazing, but there you go. That's probably where the fish story comes from.
Interesting.
And so a lot of people, and certainly the Catholic Church, prohibited eating meat on Fridays, and so people turned to fish. So I suspect that that's where it came from.
All right, but it's not particularly something that stands out in the Bible, is it?
No, you don't find, well, it doesn't stand out in the Bible, and you don't find any directive to actually eat fish. you only find church traditions saying don't eat meat.
That's amazing. That's awesome. Thank you, Dr. John. We're going to go into another little break, and we'll be back with Dr. John shortly. Don't forget, you can send your questions through 0401 949 901 949 949. So far this morning, very interesting, Dr. John, in regards to fish. Where did eating fish at Easter time come from? And it's not particularly biblical. Interesting reason that you had there. And now, Dr. John, we had another question that came in regards to Uluru, and somebody who was watching David Attenborough on TV, and they'd seen Uluru from above with all those parallel ridges running in the same direction. What's the cause of that, and what do you make of the millions of years story that's put forward?
Yeah, well, look, it was interesting, Mick. I don't know whether you saw that program, but I did. And just like our listener, I had seen it previously. And the way it started off with a shot of a cassowary. And the cassowary was a male cassowary with a couple of chicks. Mm-hmm. And apparently in cassowaries, it's the male that looks after the little chicks. And he did a great job of looking after them. He was feeding them, breaking up food for them, and so on. But the implication was that cassowaries are very ancient leftovers from the time of the dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. And, of course, evolutionists believe that birds evolved from dinosaurs and other reptiles. Now, that's just their belief. They don't have any evidence for it, and I could give you a dozen reasons why it's absolutely impossible. Mm-hmm. But the evolutionists base it on the similar appearance, I suppose, of their feet. Cassowaries have got great big feet, a bit like dinosaurs, and of course they all come out of eggs. But it's very, very easy when you have a look at it to see how ridiculous that idea is, because reptile eggs and birds' eggs are totally different. Reptile eggs tend to be more leathery, and birds' eggs, of course, have got a calcified shell. And reptile eggs don't need to be turned. When you see the mother turtle lay her eggs in the sand, she just drops the eggs there, and they just sit there until they hatch. But, of course, birds have to sit on their eggs, they have to incubate them, they have to turn them, and there is a huge difference, of course, when the young come out. Reptile hatchlings, they're able to be self-sufficient from the moment they get out of that shell. You know, you see the little turtles wandering off down towards the water, trying to avoid the seagulls picking them off as they go. But, that's one of the things that you notice with reptiles. But there's a lot more that we can talk about, and we will do that in a minute.
Yes, and, of course, about the ridges on the rock. You're on 94.9 this morning. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And, we'll be back with Dr. John shortly. Oh, edit. Yeah, cut down from just under a quarter of an hour long, that song. An amazing song. Hey, it's 20 minutes to 9. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. At Creation do have their own website, creation.com, where you can get almost any question answered about, creation, evolution. But we've got Dr. John here at the moment answering your questions. Simply text them through to 0401 949 949. We love your questions, and Dr. John's been answering a couple of them this morning about fish at Easter, and then about a show that was on last week. One of our listeners, Bob, rang up and told us about the show. That was a David Attenborough narrated show, and they were talking about all sorts of interesting things about, evolution in regards to, little dinosaurs turning into birds and that sort of thing, and also about Uluru. But you were talking about the eggs, Dr. John, the dinosaur eggs and the bird eggs being so completely different.
Yes, well, of course, what the program, and I mean, let's face it, David Attenborough programs are just absolutely brilliant. Mm-hmm. And some of the footage that they had of this cassowary and his little chicks. It was really just outstanding. And, I mean, you got to be very, very concerned because one of the little chicks got threatened and looked like it might have got eaten by some other animal or whatever. You know, there's always a bit of tension in those David Attenborough programs. But really it was great. But they do imply that evolution is a fact. And they do believe that reptiles, dinosaurs in particular, did turn into birds, and that's why they started the program with the cassowary. But I've seen a lot of those David Attenborough programs, and the very, very big difference that you can immediately notice with little baby reptiles is how they can fend for themselves immediately. And I can remember seeing a little chameleon come out of an egg and crawl up a branch and start sticking its tongue out and catching flies straight away. You know, so that is one of the major differences between the two. Reptile hatchlings can fend for themselves absolutely straight away, but birds can't. You know, every baby bird, if it didn't have parental nurture, it would obviously die. So that's one of the reasons why you can't see a connection between reptiles evolving into birds. And I mentioned too that they look at the feet, the three-toed feet of things like cassowaries, and say how similar they are to the three-toed feet of dinosaurs, for example, the velociraptors or whatever it is that they think they evolved from. But when you look at the embryological development, you find that the feet of reptiles, the three toes, develop from three different digits to the ones that birds develop from. So it's quite different, and there are so many other differences as well. I mean, we know that birds have got feathers and they're warm-blooded, reptiles have got scales and they're cold-blooded. And scales are not, or feathers are not frayed scales. The feathers are a very, very intricate design. They're wonderful, wonderfully well-designed things. And there's just no way that scales could have evolved into feathers. Scales are skin folds, whereas feathers come from hair follicles.
Absolutely. But I've got to say, they use some of the best videographers on the planet to do the David Attenborough shows. So it's easier to believe something when it looks really professional. Just because he says stuff, though, and they've got, you know, really professional-looking video doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. You know, we see stuff on the internet, and you look at a really poor-looking web page as opposed to a good one, and you go, well, the poor-looking one could even be a fake, whereas the really good-looking one, they've spent the time and the effort, it's probably real. But when it comes to this sort of stuff, just because they have a good videographer and great close-ups and all that sort of stuff doesn't necessarily mean that the narration's correct.
Yeah, well, one lends credence to the other. Because the video is so good, you think, well, what they're saying must be right as well.
Absolutely. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 16 minutes to 9. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Active You Will Never Run. It's 13 minutes to 9. And we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And he's answering your questions. Simply text them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. And Dr. John, we had a question in regards to Uluru and those ridges running across the top of the rock. Where did they come from?
Yeah, that was a great. It was part of the earlier question about on the David Attenborough program. You know, the millions of years evolution of reptiles into birds, and then of course they showed quite a bit about Uluru. And Uluru, anybody who really is interested in the history of Uluru should go to the Creation Ministries website, creation.com, because we've got a lot of information about it. And we've actually got a little pamphlet that we do hand out about Ayers Rock. And Ayers Rock is really, really interesting. Our listener spoke about all those grooves that you see on the top of the rock. And when most people superficially look at Ayers Rock, it just looks like a great big boulder sitting out there on the sand in the middle of the desert. But most people probably wouldn't realise looking at it that it's actually sedimentary rock. And it's not horizontal sedimentary layers. It was, but Ayers Rock is actually tilted up on its end, and there's much more of the rock below the surface. In fact, the amount of sedimentary rock out there in the middle of the Australian desert is just enormous. And Ayers Rock is actually only the tip of a huge iceberg. Figuratively speaking, you don't get too many icebergs out there in the middle of the Australian desert. But, yeah, that's what it is. And it's a conglomerate of small and large grains of rock, all mixed together and unsorted. And what that means is that it had to have been formed by a massive and torrential flood. Mm-hmm. Because little Mickey Mouse type floods actually sort the grains. You know, you get the heavier ones depositing out, and then the smaller ones getting carried on. But when you find these unsorted grains, like you get with the composition of Uluru, it means absolutely massive floodwaters. Mm. And it would then have taken an enormous tectonic upheaval to lift the rock up on its end, because that's what it is. Mm. And the sedimentary layers are vertical, they're not horizontal, and the grooves in the top are erosion by water. Mm. And when you look at it, and this is what the geologists that work for Creation Ministries have said, you can look at it and you can see that it has to have been done very, very recently, because there's been minimal erosion. You don't find boulders littered around the bottom of Ayers Rock, boulders that have broken off. So it couldn't possibly have been sitting there for millions and billions of years.
Actually, so Dr. John, I'm looking at Google Earth right now at Uluru, and it is amazing. Now that you've said that, because I had no idea that it had tilted on its edge. It looks like a rock that has literally just melted into the ground, or maybe, had a big sinkhole or something, or mud underneath, and it's just spun over, and you can see those perfectly straight lines right through the centre there. That's amazing.
That's right, and they are horizontal. They're sedimentary rock layers that were horizontal but have been tilted up to the vertical. Mm. And the amount of rock underneath the sand is just incredible. It's enormous. And it's interesting that the way all of that sedimentary rock in the middle of the Australian desert had to have formed would have been a massive flood. Mm. And, of course, Noah's flood was the greatest one that's ever occurred on the face of the earth. And as the Bible tells us, at the end of the flood, there was this tectonic upheaval, and all the mountain ranges that we see around the world, including what we see in the middle of Australia with Ayers Rock, a part of that tectonic upheaval, everything tilted up, pushed up, and that's how we have the topography of the earth today. It's all come from the events that occurred after Noah's flood. Wow. Really is amazing.
That is incredible.
And of course, at the end of that, we following on from Noah's flood, we had an ice age, and there were lots of ice bridges and land bridges between all of the continents. And when the ice age finally melted, a lot of the islands and so on got separated. I mean, Tasmania obviously was joined to Australia in the beginning, but when the ice age melted, then Tasmania was separated off, and so were the other Bass Strait Islands. So really, it's just incredible what really did happen if you believe the Bible, and you then interpret what you find in the light of the Bible. And that's what you'll find if you go to the creation.com website and type in Uluru or Ayers Rock.
Absolutely. And then even if I look at the Olgas, I can see how the rocks, unlike Ayers Rock, they're standing the other way up. You can see sort of the layers, the normal layers, and then the ridges in the top of the Olgas are all weird angles and shapes. That's just from normal erosion. but you can actually see where the layers are, and they're sitting horizontally as opposed to vertically like Hare's Rock. That is amazing. I didn't know that. Thank you, Dr. John. We will be back with... He's been talking to us this morning about fish at Easter and also about, I guess, the age of things and evolution, you know, dinosaurs not turning into birds. And we've also been looking at Uluru. And Dr. John, I've been literally looking at Uluru on Google Earth as you were speaking and finding it absolutely amazing, looking at Uluru and then comparing it to the Olgas, which is only 20 k's away. It's the next sort of biggest rock formation just up the road. And interesting, looks like the same sort of rock, but it hasn't tilted on edge. And I'd never heard about that before. I didn't know why the ridges on Uluru were all across the top, because it had tilted on edge. And, of course, it does look like a giant flood's done that. And then you look at the Olgas, and they have pretty much the same sedimentary layers. They look just as far apart, but they're sitting horizontally instead of vertically, which, you know, really says you're absolutely right. That rock has just tilted on edge, and it must have been one big flood and a few big earthquakes to do that.
Yeah, it really is amazing, and anybody who wants to know more about it can go to the creation.com website, because we've got quite a few articles. But look, as I've said many times, we like to discuss these issues, and we love your questions, because what they all do is they demonstrate the truth of the biblical account of origins. That really is what it's all about. And everything has got a reasonable explanation when you see it in the light of what the Bible says. You find that the evidence is absolutely consistent with the biblical story. And, you know, Mick, we're living in a day where confidence in biblical truth is more important than